land is your land, and this land is my land. From the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters.
Hi, I'm Beryl Bernay. Welcome to Weekend Magazine. We've got a pretty interesting show today. We usually do. Today we're going to meet Mrs. Kathy Tucker, who will tell us about the Eastville Historical Society and some of the history of our area. And then we're going to have a talk with Larry Penny about some of the environmental issues that we're facing in this community and what we should know about what affects all of us. So we're going to start right away. This is Mrs. Kathy Tucker. Welcome. And Mrs. Tucker is from Sag Harbor. And suppose you tell me, I know you're one of the founders of the Eastville Historical Society, and suppose you tell us something about it.
Well, the Eastville Historical Society was founded by 2 or 3 people in the beginning, and our interests developed from seeing the church that was built in 1840. And after we had seen this church, someone said, well, if this church was here in 1840 and it's an African Methodist church, then there must have been more black people here in this early time. And we began to look into the history. First, we were interested in the church, and then finally we said, well, let's see what was the life of the people who came to this church. And I would like for you to see the picture of the
all right, let's
church,
look at the church,
the church that we are
right.
discussing now.
All right.
The church is an AME sign church built by the people who lived in the community, and the 16 members of the white Methodist church that was downtown came to this church and said, well, we will begin to make our own church. And they bought in 1839, they bought the land to build the church, and it was built in 1840.
1839 they bought the land.
Yes, the land was bought. We have the deed we got from Riverhead. And the land was bought in 1839. In 1840, the church was built. And through the years, it has had a history of difficulties in finances and membership being very limited.
Tell me something, if the white members built the church or bought the land to build the church, was it right away called the African Methodist Church? So right away there were black members?
It was not bought by the white. It's the group of people who withdrew from the white church had been members of that church, but they were Indians and blacks.
Also?
Yes, and we even have a person who was a Presbyterian member of the Presbyterian Church.
Do you know how large that congregation was in the beginning? That
congregation began with 16 people.
That was the total.
That included number of people.
Included Indian, black,
yes.
Irish in that time, or no?
There were other people who did belong to that. Because we had in our cemetery, and we have the minutes of someone who's Sweezy, who is a very common name through here, that was a member of the trustee board there.
The interesting thing is, though, that the name of the church always had African in it.
Well, it is African Methodist Church is a denomination throughout the United States that after freedom of slavery and before, even when they had their little churches in the North, and slaves had hidden churches too.
Yeah, but that's what's interesting here too, because this is before the end of slavery. This church was founded in 1940. Slavery didn't end for another 20 years.
That's right.
So,
and well, African was a word to identify when we used it with the church as a black, we say minority at this time. It was built in 1840, which was before the freedom of the slaves, and there are rumors that this church was part of the Underground Railroad.
That's what I wondered.
That came used for the freedom of slavery.
That's what I wondered.
There is a trap door. The original, this church, I must say, is one of the oldest structures in Sag Harbor of any church. And there are many rumors about the structure. It's an old structure, which is the original 1840. In 1891, the front was added with the vestibule in front, and there has been a recreation room and kitchen in back. But the old structure has a trap door that we feel was used when the slaves were
I'm sure it
came
was.
through.
Let's see
Now,
some of those other slides.
Now we have the
yeah.
there's a plaque with the trustees of the church, and I must tell you about this minister who makes it possible that we did have the Underground Railroad in here. Reverend Thompson was the first minister who stayed only about a year and a half or 2 years. Then he became known and became a bishop throughout the country. He was in Virginia, and he really was an abolitionist. And since he did live here, and the slave Underground Railroad went past Long Island up into New Bedford and into New York City, we would think it's probable that he did recommend this church as a stopover, because churches were used at that time as a place to hide slaves. Many people thought because slaves became part of the northern population that they were safe, but they did have people who would hunt slaves and took them back and resold them.
Let me tell you something that's interesting. I was very active in the Poor People's Campaign and Martin Luther King's campaign in the 1960s. And I came up from Mississippi with the group that came up in 1967. To go to Washington and put up Resurrection City. And we used the churches too. He always used the churches not just for stopovers, but also as hiding places in a way, because the people were really after all of us on the way up, and I had to get down on the floor in the buses and in the cars when we were going through some of the worst places in the South, and in the churches they had to keep all the doors locked once the people got inside to just stay over. We slept over like in a dormitory. They'd have food waiting at these stopovers, and they modeled it on the on the Underground Railroad.
Well, much of the 60s was somewhat on the same thing. You were hiding, and it's any way to protect yourself. Well, this is why we feel that this church is possibly one of those. Reverend Thompson married a woman in Sag Harbor, and he was brought back there to be buried. So we know he never lost contact with Sag Harbor people. In fact, we have an article from the Sag Harbor News that says that the largest number of people, black people, they said colored at that time, that ever assembled in Sag Harbor was at Reverend Thompson's funeral. So we can imagine how few blacks were there. Now, this was his tombstone that was there at the time. There are other important people in the area of Eastville, and one of the things I would like to make very clear, that Eastville was never just a black populated area. It was always quite integrated. We had people who came there in Sag Harbor in the 1800s. There was a watch company called the Fay Watch Case Company, and they made watch cases. So they had laborers for that company who came there and lived in the Eastville area. We had the Yardley family, who is still there, lived there.
We have to get back. That's very important, that it was always an integrated community.
Area, yes.
Always an integrated community.
Yes, and it still is.
And still is. And it's
community.
very important. One of the things that I feel is most important for us to know in this community is that there has to be more communication between the different groups who live here. I feel so strongly about that, and it's the heritage of this community. It's so important. So, and it's really what made this community unique 100 years ago, and more than 100 years ago, and today the separation has kind of taken over. Well, we've got to get rid of that separation.
Well, I think
right?
I think that is one of the strong and most beautiful things about the community. And you're right. There is some more communication now that's beginning to get involved with them.
Did we already saw the pictures of some of the houses?
Well,
that
we will
people
give you
live
a
in,
quick
right?
look at some of the houses.
No. We did already, I think, right?
In Eastville.
All right.
Yes,
Talk about who some of these people were, about the whalers and the slave trade. Tell us about that and how they started coming in.
Yes, one of the things that we were not, and many people were not aware of, that blacks and Indians who lived in Sag Harbor area were very important in the whaling trade. And we had the Cuffey family, who was an outstanding whalers, and it's a large family of Indians. If you look at the whaling list, you will see the Ward family, the Ruggs, and many of the blacks who were there were outstanding whalers who went out. Practically every whaling ship had blacks on them, and Indians and Portuguese. And one of the interesting things with the Portuguese fishermen, they were outstanding fishermen have a history of being outstanding seamen. And many of the slaves were brought up by Portuguese. We do know that some Portuguese fishermen, or it's said, brought slaves into the North Shore and had the Shinnecock Indians to hide them. And
that started some more of the mixture.
That brought in more mixtures of blacks coming through. If they came into the Shinnecock area, they had to come across the island. And as people migrate to different places, some drop off and they become permanent residents of that area.
Since the whalers were mostly men, they married a lot of the Shinnecock Indian women, right? Is that where some of the mixture comes in, because so much of the black and Indian is mixed from the people who've been here for generations?
Well,
right?
this is felt to be true, and you had some slaves in Long Island in the 1700s.
Really?
And Long Island has a history of having black
farms?
slaves in farms, house workers. If you look at the census and East Hampton records, East Hampton has records, there's a list of how many slaves in the household. So you did have some blacks who came who were not runaways, and some, I'm sure, who stayed over as having been when New York outlawed slavery.
I want to see if we can see this map of yours.
I think they have it. I think it's over there.
Well, maybe somebody can see it. I just wanted to show that the passage from, if we can, I don't know if we can show it, we'll try, of the way the slaves came up in the Underground Railroad, the way they came up. Let's see if this will show.
The whole?
I don't know. I don't know what you can get, but see if possible. This is some of the slave route coming up from the South and from different parts of the South to New York and Connecticut, and since in those days also this part of Long Island was only accessible through Connecticut, most accessible through Connecticut by boat. A lot of them came across from New Bedford to Sag Harbor and the East End, and we think that's where most of the blacks came from, who were in the Underground Railroad, who settled here, and that was as you know, if the church was built and founded in 1840, that was say they had started coming in a few years before, certainly. So this was since the early 1800s, there had been this mixture of people in this area.
In the area, yes. Yes, very much so in the early 1800s.
And then you brought something that I think is important to read.
And I had something that we, I don't know if we could read all of this now, but we'll talk about what, it was found in the Sag Harbor Express, October 21st, 1866.
That's exactly 100 years ago.
And this
for
is
those
after
of
the freedom.
who can't do
Yes,
arithmetic like me, right?
It's long ago.
Right.
And this is concerning the school system in Sag Harbor. And it says, by the school census just completed in this village, it will be seen that there are now residing in this Union School District between the ages of 7 and 21, 742 children, 711 white, and 31 blacks. We thought that the Democratic Party were a more courageous set than they really proved themselves to be. For at the last school meeting, they were so woefully afraid that the 31 colored children would eat up or otherwise damage the 711 white ones that they voted to instruct the trustees of the board to place them in a separate room. This is rather a scare for the Democratic Party, for it was
For the democracy.
for the democracy.
For the country.
For it has ever been a custom of practice in this place, which means Sag Harbor, even back in the old district school days, to have the white and colored in the same school. But the whole secret of this vote may be summed up in a nutshell, and it is this: that some of these colored children are smarter than some of the white ones, as will be seen by the proceeding of the last examination. When in the promotion of the intermediate to the academic department, William Johnson, who was an Eastville resident, and I'm adding that, colored, stood first on the list, and Mary Consul, also colored, stood fifth. We would think that our Democratic friends would feel jealous. Since writing the above, we have learned that there is a separate room for the colored children. When they become so advanced, it is in their studies that they cannot longer be taught in that department. They are then advanced to the other department. Thus, it is of these two of whom our Democratic friends are jealous, notwithstanding that they stood high in scholarship than any others. And this I copied from the Sag Harbor newspaper, which was printed, which was for the Eastville people, having been in school with white all these years. It must have been kind of devastating and affected their lives very much at that time.
Tremendously. And imagine that this is verbatim from the Sag Harbor paper
This
of
is
100 years ago, when they separated these children, these 31 children, from the 742, because they were afraid these children were smarter. And that's really what it says.
Well, this is what it
which
says.
is what it's so against everything this country is for. And so often when people come into this country, into another area of this country, the people around are so afraid. It's what's been going on in parts of this country about Asian children coming in, about children coming in from Central America.
Yeah.
And people are saying, we don't want them. Why? They're smarter. That's what it really adds up to. They work hard. It's not that they're smarter, they work hard.
Well, yes, and many times we feel that when we have experiences like this, I think for blacks in general, even in the 60s when you were fighting, is the fact that when you separate, you can limit people's accomplishment, because you can limit what you expose them to. And I think this is one of the most devastating thing about this whole separate but equal education
especially since this is just after slavery was abolished, and it says that before slavery was abolished, when there were black people in this community through the years before that, there was no separation. And this is a couple of years after slavery was abolished, and suddenly there's this separation. I wonder how long it lasted.
This is what I wanted to say to you. I went through all the papers looking for some statement of ending. When did this end? And I don't know if Sag Harbor has school records or anything that shows this. But I will say that I did another thing that I went through the school records of 1866, and I didn't see these names listed.
Really?
I didn't
The
see
names
none
of these two children
these
who were
children
supposed to be
that we
such
know
honor
were black,
students. Oh
but
my.
we know were black. So I don't know if these children's
my.
names were carried on records
Oh
at
my.
that time. So I really would like to.
I hope you
know
get to
when
look
this
into
ended.
this. You
Yes,
ought to look a little
yes, I
further
would.
into this. Mrs.
But
Tucker does a lot of research on this subject, and she's been doing this research for what, a few years now, right?
Yes, about 5 or 6
and
years.
you're gonna
I'm a
keep
newcomer
going.
to Sag Harbor area, but I have
Newcomer
been
meaning how
researching
many years?
About 10, because so many people tell me they were here in the 30s.
I'm a newcomer too. I've only been here 4 years. But it's amazing how this area is so interesting, and that's what brought us here in the first place, that we feel like part of it, you know, even the first year. So you started researching this whole background very soon after you came. So that's it. I want to thank you so much. I know that you have something for the children when it's Black History Week, and I'd like you to come back. We'll do some more anyway in the meantime, but I'd very much like you to come back, and we'll try to get some of the children involved in this history, okay, and knowing more about it, all right?
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having us and
Oh,
share
well.
our information with you.
Yeah, well, there needs to be a lot more sharing going on around here. Okay.
You're right.
Thanks.